approach to spectrum allocation, I request our moderator, Ms. Aarti Holla-Maini, Secretary General GSOA, to please join us on the dais. Thank you very much, Bubbly. It's my pleasure to be moderating this next session as well. And I would like to just extend my good wishes to Mr. Saxena, who I understand has been taken ill yesterday. Let's hope for the very best for him. Could I please invite the panelists to join me on stage? So we have Mr. Rajeev Kumar, Director of Engineering from Doordarshan, Laura Roberti, Director for Spectrum and Market Access at Telesat, Tony Azzarelli, founder of the Access Space Alliance, and Mr. Bharat Gupta, Head of Corporate Affairs at Sterlite Technologies Limited. So we're going to again have a dynamic discussion around some of the issues concerning spectrum allocation and a balanced approach to spectrum assignment in India. Let me just set the scene. I can certainly say that India has kept GSOA members and the broader satellite industry really on our toes with its plans to potentially auction off satellite spectrum in the Ka band, which thankfully has not happened yet. And fingers crossed that it won't, but we'll come to that in a minute. But in a country like India, balance between technologies and the spectrum that each of those technologies needs is more important than ever. While we see in this country a very successful mobile industry which really shows how connectivity can be made affordable for the masses, still the digital divide in this country is pervasive, and there are plenty of areas where mobile will simply not penetrate, given how hard it is to make the business case close. We're going to dive into a conversation with the panelists today around the topic of a balanced approach to spectrum, which ultimately also reflects a balanced approach to the different technological solutions that are required to meet the objectives and ambitions and challenges faced by a country like India. So I'm going to take my seat and we're going to get started. Thank you for joining us. It's working. Good. So for all of our panelists, the Indian government is bringing about a new telecoms bill. The Indian Telegraph Act was formulated in 1885. It stood the test of time, but the government feels that the act needs modernization to keep up with all of the technological developments that are happening in the telecom space. And we know that there are many. We know it's not easy for governments to keep up with regulation to match the pace of technology advancement. That's not easy for any government, and especially in India where things are moving so fast, but yet where even basic challenges still prevail. So another aspect is the allocation and assignment of spectrum. Today the assignment of spectrum is driven more by various judicial interventions as opposed to legislation. The new act aims to bring the spectrum allocation and assignment under its ambit, and the bill is very forward-looking, and it aims to bring in some of the modern concepts in regulation in spectrum allocation and assignment. Yesterday we saw some important announcements, and I would like to explore the implications, the consequences, the thinking behind some of them. So first of all, I would like to just have an opening round where I ask all of you to spell out in just a couple of minutes what expectations you have from the draft telecoms bill. Bharat, can I start with you?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Aarti, for asking the first question. And as you know, you have just spoken that we already have a telecom bill, or the Indian Telegraph Bill of 1885, which is now under revision, and a new draft telecom bill is being formulated. So there are a lot of expectations from it, especially as as a bill that should be able to support the growth of the sector for at least next 50 years, 100 years or so. India today is talking about two important concepts. We are talking about the Atmanirbharta, and we are also talking about Antyodaya. Now, Atmanirbharta and Antyodaya, both of them would require some forward-looking, concepts. And in that, to begin with, the first and foremost important thing which comes to my mind is coming to the infrastructure part of it. We need to build very solid and very robust, scalable infrastructure, wherein we see a role of IP1s which is getting enhanced. That is what we are looking at. The present definition of the infrastructure services which is included in the draft telecom bill looks little, there is a need for expanding it. So that is one that one is looking at. Also, there are issues primarily related to the Telecom Development Fund, be it related to research and development and innovation. I mean, there are a large number of facets which needs to be looked into, and I think if we move ahead and if these provisions, some positive provisions are included in the bill, we definitely will see some good changes in the future.
Excellent, thank you very much. Tony, can I bring you in? Can you allow me to ask you how you believe that the availability and the cost of satellite capacity is going to shape India's digital goals in the context and under the framework that the new telecoms bill is setting out?
Okay, so thank you, and thanks to the organizer to invite me here for speaking, and also we're doing the panel tomorrow as well, for doing the panel. Let's say from the perspective, I'm an expert in the space and satellite domain. I was also myself once a regulator working for Ofcom, head of the space and science department in Ofcom. And all I wish, actually, I haven't read the bill, I have to say, I'll be honest with you, but I think I would welcome very much the bill, and my hope is that it sees more the perspective of helping the consumers, helping the users to have access to services, have access to connectivity and communications. That requires actually a light approach to licensing, to policy on spectrum management and so forth, because otherwise we're not going to progress in providing that needed connectivity to the end users. I made a point this morning on the mobility, for example. If the government and various departments do not see that there is a transport requirement, there is a health requirement, there's an education requirement, and if they don't sit down together around the table to see what the infrastructure requirements are, then and create policies to allow that infrastructure to actually be realized, then they're not solving the connectivity problem. So my hope is, again, is that the bill will provide for that needed light touch basis of regulations, which will actually allow end users to use services and connectivity and telecommunications, and also which will grow the economy. That is quite important, because often when I go around the world for market access, I know countries are screaming about connectivity, but then I find very high barriers to entry, very high fees for spectrum use, licensing, which actually stop anyone which has the technology available to bring it into the country. And so my hope is that the new bill will help foreign investment to come into India, but with lower barriers to entry. Otherwise, we're going to go back to square one. You had a question most likely on options, but we can discuss that in a bit. Thank you.
That's excellent, thank you. Laura, can I bring you in with your thoughts on the draft bill, please?
Yes, thank you for your question, Aarti. Overall, I guess we all hope, as a satellite industry, from the bill is an overall, first of all, it's very welcome because it replaces regulations that, yes, stood the test of time, but they are now obsolete, if nothing else, for the year in which they were issued. So what we hope for is for a streamlined, clear regulatory framework that reflects the international best practices, while at the same time taking into account, of course, the domestic priority.
Brilliant, thank you. Rajeev, can I bring you in to share your first thoughts on the bill?
I will start with the saying from the Gita, Atma Ajar Amar Hai. That is true for spectrum as well. Spectrum is Ajar Amar, means it cannot be destroyed and it is not going to be die. So we can use it for our welfare, and keeping that in the mind, this new telecom bill has been prepared. The main highlights of the bill, what I perceive, is technology neutrality and at the same time technology agnostic. Means what I understand, that if operator or service provider finds some better technology or newer technology, it can change the technology using the same spectrum, if I understand correctly the matter given in the bill. That is very good. Then spectrum reforming, which is a kind of issue. Spectrum sharing and leasing, that is also part of this bill. And most of the things will certainly benefit towards our goal for giving best to the consumer or the citizen. One more item which I find that is very much emphasized in this bill, that is the national requirement, that is national security, disaster management, law and order situation, and other strategic issues. That is given due weightage in this bill, and that can be addressed suitably with the help of this new bill. I hope this will be very good for the people of India. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mahesh, could I just bring you in with your initial thoughts on the bill?
Sure. Thanks, Aarti, and thanks, SIA, for the invitation. And the way I look at it is pretty much on the lines of what Tony just spoke. Couple of things. One is, of course, that the telecommunications industry, or telecommunications itself and associated technologies, are today central to both the economy, to governance, to social integration and all of that. And that is why one key thing that we require from legislation is an enabling environment. An enabling environment that allows, subject to some key considerations, for example, the point that was made about security, subject to some of those key considerations, the ability for players, for technologies, and for business models to compete in the marketplace, because it's been demonstrated across the world that that is the best way to expand markets, that is the best way of delivering services to people, for those services to be used by people, etc., etc. And so we needed an enabling environment for which the evidence globally is you don't need me to point that out. So once you look at it from that point of view, then you, in my view, you needed to have done two or three things. One is obviously to deal with issues relating to scarce resources like spectrum. You needed a sensible approach to spectrum which recognizes its scarcity and its value to users, the economy, etc., etc. That you see it as an important resource, but not necessarily a resource to either increase costs of providing services, or for that matter to intervene in the markets in favor of one or the other technology or particular types of service. So that is one set of areas that I would have wanted an enabling environment where sensible decisions can be taken about spectrum and scarce resources in general. And the last point I would make is that, in my very humble opinion, there are three kinds of protections that no country or no regulatory regime can ignore. One is obviously the protection of consumers. The second, in telecom, this thing is the protection of networks. And the third is the protection of national security. All these three things are absolutely central to telecommunications. And I extend this to say that what we need is as little regulation, as few rules as possible, which do not have to do with these, right? And so we need an enabling environment, which the bill goes to some extent to attempt. I think it is a mixed bag. I do not believe that the bill has got it right. I think it has got certain things certainly not right, and particularly relating to the subject of this particular Space Congress, which is obviously satellite communications. I believe there are gaps there, but we can discuss them if Aarti will take a step. Is that fine?
Thank you very much. Yes, you talked about an enabling environment. You're picking up on what Tony said earlier. We see all too often, you know, the technology is there, the demand is there for the connectivity, but the regulatory framework stands in the way. Now, let me zoom in on the 28 gigahertz band, because this has been, you know, the satellite industry was watching with concern about what would happen in India. Now the NAFP, which has been issued yesterday, talks about 28 gigahertz as for mixed use. Now, what is that? What does that mean for us going forward? Does it mean that we're still going to see a spectrum auction of this satellite band in the future? Laura, can I bring you in to start with on that?
Thank you for your very relevant question, in fact. If I may, I would start from the matter of the auction, which is in fact more general than just 28 gigahertz. In general, and I believe in this respect to be able to speak on behalf of the satellite industry and not only Telesat, the satellite industry is of the view that spectrum should not be auctioned for satellite use, especially when it comes to spectrum in microwave frequencies. And by microwave frequencies, I'm referring to frequencies of the C-band and above, so more or less 4 gigahertz and more. And why is that the case? The reason is very simple, because it does not, to use a strong expression, it does not make sense from the point of view of a best practice. And why? So if I may go back a step, auctions are typically used to assign a spectrum for terrestrial mobile use. And why is that? Because these things don't have a directive antenna, they have an omnidirectional antenna. And why? Because they need to connect with the closest base station that could be anywhere around us. When it comes to, so auction makes sense because they cannot, if I have this mobile, and my friend Tony is another one, our two mobiles, they cannot use, and if they connect to two different operators, they cannot use the same frequency in the same location at the same time. It's impossible. So there needs to be a separation in spectrum, or at least a geographical separation, hence the auction. When it comes to satellite, in microwave frequencies, the situation is completely different. So let's imagine that I'm the antenna of satellite operator A, and Tony is the antenna of satellite operator B. Can we operate in the same location at the same time in the same frequency? And the answer is yes, because the antenna is big enough to be directive and to point at the wanted satellite and not the unwanted one, and not to cause interference. And this is why an auction does not make sense. If this spectrum would be auctioned, what would happen? Let's imagine that the spectrum is a cake, is auctioned, I win half, Tony wins half. Is this effective? No, because it leads to an artificial partition of the spectrum. I can use only half and hence provide half the capacity, while in principle I could use all of it, and he could use all of it. Alternatively, let's say there is an auction and I win all the cake, so I have all the spectrum, but that leads to a monopolistic situation in which I'm in charge of the spectrum, so I can block him from entry. And then again, I don't believe that is particularly productive from the point of view of the user, because again, it hampers the choice, it limits the choice. Very brief on 28 gigahertz, again, I haven't looked at the new frequency allocation plan in detail, but I understand that there is mixed use for 1 gigahertz, 27.5 to 28.5. So let's see what happens. In terms of satellite industry, we feel very strongly about this band. They should be retained for satellite because there is so much other choice for IMT, also in terms of identification at WRC level. I could add more, but I prefer to leave the floor to others, and I can answer it now.
Thank you. Laura is available for tutorials on satellite spectrum if anybody is interested. She does a brilliant job in making it clear. Thank you. Let's stay on that topic. Tony, let me bring you in. We have seen the lessons learned. We, as the industry, have seen the lessons learned on potentially auctioning 28. We have seen what happened in Korea. We've seen what happened in Singapore, in Hong Kong, Brazil. Okay, but let's take Korea. It was already some years ago when it was auctioned, and some years later, only 200 base stations. This is not efficient for anybody. And in fact, it hampers the development of the sector. So why is India not looking at what's happening elsewhere? Do you have a take on this? And then I'm going to bring in our Indian colleagues to comment on this.
So thank you, Aarti. Let me start with the following. What is the question that's been asked? And why is auction the answer? And I don't think actually there's a clear question to be asked here. When WRC 12 said no identification of IMT, which is 5G, 4G, whatever, is allowed in the 28 gigahertz band. That was a WRC agenda item pushed by the manufacturers, basically, not by the satellite operator, but the MNOs, basically, by the manufacturers of 5G, basically. And is there a demand for having 5G in 28 gigahertz? I don't think there is a demand, basically. And when actually the MNOs are still struggling to fill C-band, they're still struggling to fill the S-band, I'm talking about the 3G bands, basically, and now have new allocations for 26 gigahertz. So WRC 12 provided 26 gigahertz availability for IMT, 5G. Also, WRC 19 made available the spectrum at the QMB band for IMT and 5G. So why is why those few countries, and Korea started it all because the manufacturing industry at WRC 12 pushed for that, and I saw them cry at the end of the WRC. I was there. You were there as well, I remember. So they were pushing for that. So they went in for the auctions in Korea, and Japan followed suit. And then I guess other countries like Australia, but USA was the one actually pushing for it as well, I remember. But there is no actual need of 28 gigahertz, actually, when there is other spectrum still available to be used by 5G. Now, what is 5G? That's the other question. Does anybody know what 5G is? I went to a course at the ITU, a seminar course. 5G is about 70% for IoT type connectivity. When we're looking at about 60 billion to 100 billion devices of IoT to be connected, basically, by 2030. But hey, Ka band is not the right band for IoT devices because you have a lot of attenuation from the atmosphere. You have rain attenuation from the atmosphere. Those are not the bands for IoT type 5G applications. Well, actually, they look for unlicensed spectrum, not licensed or auction spectrum, unlicensed spectrum. Operators today, MNOs, have no money left from the auctions than the money they actually spent on 3G. That's the other question, the other issue I have. I was at Ofcom asking my chief economic officer at Ofcom, I asked him the question, why are we auctioning more spectrum when actually 3G failed? Auctions at 3G failed in what sense? Users have no quality of service because basically when they auction and they assign the licenses, they didn't put a clause on quality of service. Instead, those that did the beauty contests in other countries did ask for full connectivity of the country, did ask for quality of service. They didn't pay a penny for the license, but they they made a promise. They may possibly paid a little bit, but not as much as the 3 billion, 4 billion that were done for 3G auctions. But let me just so there is an issue with auctions because it doesn't actually answer the questions. 28 gigahertz, again, why do we need to do? I think because I suppose India is copying or following what other countries are trying to do, but where is the manufacturing today on that? I don't see even a demand for 28 gigahertz basically as well. So unless maybe there is a genie telling everyone that is trying to auction these bands that there is a potential market at 28 gigahertz. Now, why do I believe that there is an issue here? Because between 27.5 to 30 gigahertz is a natural band for satellite, fixed satellite service, basically, as it is also another frequency band. But this is actually a very heavy band used by satellite. There is now mobility, ubiquitous services being deployed. There is also the gateway stations of some systems, like, for example, OneWeb and others, which are being deployed across the world. A lot of investment is being put forward in these bands, and I know in India there is a few of those gateway stations being constructed, basically. Although they can share with the IMT services. However, the ubiquitous ones are more difficult to share with. So there's an issue of sharing. Why don't we use administrative approaches, spectrum sharing, like the ITU actually is promoting? Why are we going against the ITU approach where IMTs should not be allowed in this band? So there is some history here that needs to be looked at, and there is a question of understanding as to the why auctions and why the questions being proposed. So I hope that the regulators, the government here, have a rethink about this, because I don't think the auctioning is the right solution for 28 gigahertz at all. They should rethink as to the why this is required and why now, actually, as well.
Thank you, Tony. You know, you were remembering back to the WRC in 2015. We don't have memories, we have nightmares of those debates. And, you know, I remember also being at the satellite conference in DC just before WRC 15, where the then FCC chairman told the satellite industry, either get on the train or be run over by it when it comes to 28. But then in 2021, so 5 years later, we hear the FCC chairman-elect at the time, Jessica Rosenworcel, saying, we made a mistake by auctioning 28 gigahertz.
But you know what's happened today? You know there was a fixed wireless access auctions of the 28 gigahertz band. There are 2 blocks, and in Europe, the UK and Sweden auction blocks of the KA band. You know what's happened now? In 2024, Sweden is going to remove the licensing they assigned by auction because no one is using them. In the UK, it's the same issue. It has auction and licensing back in 2003 and 2008, basically, reissued the licenses when I was working for Ofcom as well. And when I was asking my colleagues why, they're not using it. And there's a concept of lose it or use it. And if they're not using it, then basically why are you renewing the licenses to those operators that have a license to auctions, basically? They didn't pay much. That was about £20,000 per block, basically. So there is no money to be made here. Actually, you are sterilizing spectrum for potential use by others, especially the satellite, which is screaming out loud to use KA band. The constellations, the GSOs as well, and the gateway use, for example. There is, apart from the additional frequency bands which are available for 5G, plus the environmental atmospheric technical problems that KA band and QMV band offers to these kind of services, basically, when they in the lower frequency band.
Yeah. So I wanted to bring in our Indian colleagues. Let me start with Mahesh ji. I mean, we've just said about the lessons learned, about the US, which was the champion leading on 28 auctions, and then which said we made a mistake. What is your thinking? Is India going to look at what's happened elsewhere? Is India going to learn the lesson, or is India going to walk into the same pitfall and realize some years down the line? What's your view?
Thanks, Aarti. In fact, I think India might come to the same sort of conclusions that Tony spoke about if it was actually even to look at its own record with spectrum auctions. And I speak here as somebody who was a vehement advocate of mobile auctions. And indeed, one of the problems we had, which led to a whole lot of controversy in India's telecom sector, was because, in fact, it was the mobile spectrum that was being administratively allocated. And it led to a huge number of controversies and scams and whatever. And the argument was that here is something where the demand is far in excess of supply. There are people willing to pay good money for it, and yet we were allowing spectrum to be allocated in an administrative manner, and so on and so forth. I think we have now come full circle. We've now come to a situation where, in fact, India does auction spectrum, and including mobile spectrum. But what its own record with auctions shows is something that few people, I mean, many people know about it, but few people, I think, linger over. And one key thing is that the first time we had spectrum auctions was in 2010, where we got 5 times the reserve price that was set for the spectrum auctions. In 2014 and 15, we had something which is roughly about 3 times the price of reserve, the reserve price, which was the final. Other than these 2 auctions, the vast majority of spectrum has been sold at reserve price. In other words, they're actually only auctions in name. The actual price at which the spectrum has been sold is an administrative price set by the government of India, which is the base price for spectrum. So and there are good reasons why those 2 auctions that I mentioned led to the kind of bids that we saw. In one case, of course, there was real shortage of spectrum after several players have been licensed, and you know that story, we won't go there. The 3G auctions were, so 3G auctions were about that. And in 2014 and 15, people may be aware, there was the license tenures of current telecom operators were expiring that time, and they needed spectrum to continue services. And at that time, there was a huge competition for it, and there was pretty aggressive bidding. But other than that, we have really not had the kind of price discovery that you might actually expect in a sensibly designed auction. We've not actually had a great history of auctions in the first place. That's one. The second thing that is actually the second experience, which I think will tie into what we're talking about in the satellite case, is that not only has the spectrum not actually been auctioned through aggressive bids, but actually all the reserve price has done is raise the price of spectrum, nothing else. Because these reserve prices are high and operators have no choice, they just buy what they need. And of course, eventually, one would expect directly or indirectly the consumers pay. Now, we have a situation where you need spectrum. You neither need it exclusively, nor do you need it over a large area, nor is there the issue of a demand-supply mismatch. There is really no evidence at all that there is the demand for this spectrum, satellite spectrum, is greater than supply. There is no demand, there is no evidence that you need it over a large area, and so on and so forth. So the situation is diametrically different from what it was for mobile operators. So we must recognize this, and also recognize that it's kind of meaningless to talk about auctions when you're talking about sharing of spectrum. Right? A spectrum that can be shared is by definition the wrong kind of spectrum to be auctioned. Right? I mean, it's elementary. I think that we should recognize this, that if it can be shared, and if the government policy, as is often asserted, is not to maximize revenues, then it must make sense to ensure that the spectrum is used efficiently through this sharing. And an auction is not conducted simply for the sake of it, which is really what the biggest, in my view, drawback of the bill is. That it not only makes auctions the primary method of spectrum allocation, but also ignores the Indian experience itself in auctions, right? And so I think the fact that satellite spectrum can be shared is it's the norm else the whole world over, I think is sufficient reason why we should do it the right way rather than be forced to correct our decisions later, as several countries are now having to do. So that's
Thank you. Bharati, can I bring you in? What, in your view, is the motivation behind their wanting to auction this particular spectrum?
Can you just repeat it again?
I'm trying to, this morning I was moderating a session on 5G, and one of the things I asked the panelists is, in India, in a country like India, where you have more than half of the population not connected to internet, what is the priority? Is the priority 5G, like it is in much of the West, or is the priority to really bring internet to all? Now, the mobile operators in this country have done a great job in making mobile connectivity affordable, yet they do not go into the most rural areas because they cannot close the business case. So if they're going to be spending so much money on auctions, it's going to make it even harder for them to deliver to those areas. What is the real motivation here behind auctioning this spectrum?
So I personally feel that the panelists have already spoken about it. There is no point, having auction for this spectrum. It's more to do with the administrative allocation. That is the preferred route, because you cannot compare the millions of BTS versus a couple of satellites which are covering a particular geographical area. So the entire chunk which is given to a satellite for providing connectivity cannot be compared with the slicing and dicing of the spectrum which happens for the terrestrial networks. So that is number one. You must be aware that we have the NDCP 2018 which came up, and that essentially talks about providing rural connectivity or connectivity to all, at least the 50 Gbps connectivity to everyone. So if you look at the government programs at the moment, they are all focused in that direction. They are talking about Antyodaya, which is providing connectivity to the last man in the remotest of the place. So that is one of the major agendas of the government, which needs to be considered. Hence, as you have just said, that you go for auctions, and the prices are going to be little, as very high as compared to the ARPUs or the revenue which is generated from a subscriber through a terrestrial network. So therefore, it is going to make it unviable, or it doesn't make any economic sense. More so, if you start slicing the spectrum, let's say there is a situation, you start a hypothetical case where you start slicing the spectrum, you're not going to get the right QoS which is required for delivering the services. Hence, it is not making any sense. And yes, coming back to your question, the biggest motivation today is providing connectivity to the last man, providing connectivity to everyone. And I mean, no matter what, the TSPs may not have the interests of going into areas where they don't have the ROIs. You look at the mining sector, you look at so many enterprises which are located in rural sectors where MSMEs are operating. That's a huge opportunity. If you extend connectivities in those areas, I'm sure this is going to be huge for India.
Thank you very much. Rajeev, can I bring you in on the same question?
Actually, I belong to the broadcasting community and I represent Doordarshan. Typically, if I say 28 gigahertz band is not being used by broadcasting, but what panelist told, that the people who made auctions, they afterward they regret. They said that there was a mistake on their part. If that is the case, happened already in other part of the world, then we should learn from them and we should take care of our resources. I want to quote one thing that again, this is spectrum and this is Ajar Amar. We cannot destroy it, but there is significant loss even if there is no payment involved. It is the example of carrying a aircraft without a passenger, and if we want to recover that loss, we cannot recover any time. That loss is permanent loss. That is not the true in kind of some physical commodity, where if we are keeping kind of coal mines there, if we are not doing anything, that coal is there. We can use or reuse it. But once a flight has gone to another place without a passenger, we cannot recover that loss anytime. So that we should take care with the example from the other nations, and that we should take care.
Thank you. I would like to just come back to Bharatji for a second. One of the things that is being talked about in the bill is potential refarming of spectrum. What possibilities of spectrum refarming do you see for the SATCOM sector in India?
Yeah, Aarti, good question. See, spectrum refarming is a terminology we use primarily for the IMT, the 2G, 3G, 4G, and the 5G spectrum. Because it is quite possible. In fact, the telecom bill also talks about spectrum refarming, the draft telecom bill which is there. However, in case of the satellite communication, the bands are pretty well defined. You have the C band, that you have the KU and the KA band which are there, and primarily these have been identified looking into the various aspects, maybe the attenuation factors which play up, or the characteristics of the band to provide the connectivity, right? So, and the next important thing which must be considered is, we have spoken about it, that the entire chunk has to be allocated to a particular operator for providing the services in a geographical area. So slicing and dicing again becomes a matter which is a no-go rather in case of the space communication. So therefore, coming back to this, we can think of even there was recommendations by TRI in the band of 526, especially related to the broadcasting. There probably it was favorably recommended. However, if I look at the other bands like the C band, the KU and the KA, I don't see a possibility of refarming happening there, and it has to be given in a chunk like that.
Great, thank you. Tony, would you like to come in on the point of refarming spectrum?
You're asking me for too much now. No, refarming spectrum. Let me say the following. From experience, unfortunately, there is still use of 2G somewhere in the world, and a lot of it is to do with maybe train tracks and maybe telemetry of from power lines, I suppose. The question is it still efficient use of spectrum, and can new technologies take over that? Hopefully, 5G might be the right solution to that, because the issue is that there's still spectrum being used by technologies which are now overdue in a way, and that's not efficient use of spectrum. So I don't know if that's answering your question reforming, but maybe Laura has.
Yes, I wanted to bring Laura in.
Thank you. No, just a very few words. When it comes to satellite use, I think extreme caution needs to be used in terms of refarming spectrum. And why is that? In general, even if not always, satellites have international coverage in the sense that they cover multiple countries, and this can be at regional or even global level. And so in this respect, harmonized spectrum use is truly essential for satellite to be able to operate. Also because when a satellite is up there, of course, you can no longer change the frequencies. So it is also for this reason that it is important that use of frequency is harmonized across countries and it does not change in time. Thank you.
On that point on satellite, and Laura actually just raised a good point here. What happens over the history of time for satellite companies that they have a generation 1, they have a generation 2, they have a generation 3. You can see this with Inmarsat. I used to work for Inmarsat myself. And now we're generation 6 and maybe 7 with Inmarsat satellites, basically. But if you look at the L-band, for example, around 1.5, 1.6 gigahertz bands, the refarming in that sense means that they go from generation 1 to 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. And that is a natural, let's say, evolution of the technology, which has been deployed by Inmarsat in different orbits, and now also other technologies. But that's, in a way, let's say, in that way, it's scarce spectrum because of the fact that the terminals are not very highly directive, but it's well shared through an MOU approach, which is the L-band MOU approach, basically. It's well shared between satellite operators. It doesn't actually need intervention by governments to actually tell them you should share it like this or you should share it like that at a national level. And as Laura said, the fact that satellite require an harmonized spectrum allocation worldwide is just because we as satellite operators provide a global, let's say, service. We don't provide just a simple, a national service into only one single country. Our beams are wide, but then our satellites also may move to LEO constellations, MEO constellations, for example, as well as GEO if you have multiple GEO deployed in that respect. So refarming for satellite doesn't actually really exist, but it's more an evolution of technology that's been deployed by the same company over and over again. So it's actually reutilizing in a better way, more efficient use of the spectrum because new technology provides a more efficient use of spectrum using higher modulations, for example, now. We used to only use BPSK, QPSK 20 years ago, and that was the only technology available. Now actually I've seen 16 QAM, you know, in LEOs I have 16 QAM basically, which is actually the spectrum used much higher and efficient use, for example. So farming of satellite spectrum is not the right terminology to be used, but usually it's used for terrestrial type, like 2G over 3G, and you have to refarm the spectrum because 3G requires a different spectrum. So basically what you do with the old one for 2G, so you may refarm it to provide 3G, or you may refarm it to do something else, basically. But not for satellite. Satellite is a bit different in that respect.
Brilliant, thank you. So here we are talking about spectrum, what is feasible, what doesn't work, what works. Where's the user in all of this? Let's think about the services. We have Rajeev. Rajeev, you're in the broadcasting space. What impact do you see India's spectrum policy for satellite services having on broadcasting in the years to come? I ask because in many parts of the world, we hear that, yeah, linear TV, broadcasting, it's really, you know, it's coming to an end. In India, this is a booming market. This is a market where demand exceeds supply. It always has done, and nothing is changing on that, even if we have those in Bombay, Delhi, and other urban centers who are making use of all of the streaming services. So what impact do you think there's going to be on broadcasting with the spectrum policy that we're seeing?
Yeah, of course, right now, TV broadcasting especially is quite popular in India, and this is mostly through satellite. And terrestrial TV is also there, but almost negligible. So satellite broadcasting is quite helpful, and that's why satellite spectrum and other things should be kept intact. Right now, we can see that satellite broadcasting, normally TV broadcasting is nothing but satellite broadcasting. Satellite services, satellite communication is the backbone of this. Whatever channels are being provided to the consumer, that is uplinked on a satellite, and that is redistributed by various operators like cable TV, even terrestrial TV provider. They also relay the same signal received through the satellite, and even OTT service providers, they also receive the signal through satellite, and they redistribute over their own network. So that is very important. And why it is popular here is basically the, as you already mentioned, that something around 50% of the population is still unconnected or poorly connected. This is your statement from the earlier session. So getting signal through OTT or other means of platform, that is very difficult for most of the people. And satellite with its own principle that it covers a large area, and India being very large country, big country, diverse population, it can provide the right kind of information and entertainment both to the masses. And by name itself, broadcasting, it has broader reach through satellite. And apart from that, we have a rural and urban divide that is very, very significant in India. So that is driving our satellite broadcasting, TV broadcasting, that even radio broadcasting is also quite popular in India. And Doordarshan is also providing a DTH service that is free to air, which is unique in nature. We are providing 116 channels through that platform, and it also has 48 radio channels. That is from All India Radio. And being free to air, that is unique to the world. It is very, very popular in India. That is something around 40 million viewers are there. That is estimated. And total pay TV subscriber is something around 70 million. Because people don't want to pay every month, and that gives a quite good platform for them to get a sufficient number of channels which forms their daily bouquet. So that is where we stand right now, and maybe we'll survive and will even more diversify to attract our people to be hooked on satellite TV broadcasting. Thank you.
Can I just explore a little bit further? I wanted to ask whether you have already faced any kind of interference from INT. We know, for example, where the C-band was allocated in Africa, for example, 3.4 to 3.6 was allocated to INT, yet broadcasters who are operating in 3.7 and higher, they are facing adjacent band interference. What is the situation in India? Are you seeing any instances of interference?
Yeah, that is quite big issue actually, and it is being discussed since many years. Actually, broadcasting was using, rather satellite communication was using 3.4 to 4.2 for downlink of C-band channels. Later it was given to IMT, that was having 3.3 to 3.4. It was shifted to 3.6 first time. Then it was having a lot of problem with broadcasting receive system. Because as our system were designed for receiving 3.4 to 4.2, so it was receiving the signals of IMT as well. And IMT services and signals being terrestrial in nature, and satellite signals coming from the height of 36,000 kilometers, the difference is quite high. That is something around 60 dB lower than the IMT signal. So it was saturating the low noise block converter, which is used to receive the C-band signal, and then it converts it into L-band signal that is fed to the IRD that decodes the signal. So that saturation of LNBVG, even if it was transmitting beyond 3.7 or below 3.7, it was saturating the LNBC, so it was creating problem to the service provider. This itself is to be addressed by broadcaster. And subsequently, this has been further increased to 3670. This is reducing the guard band to 30 megahertz only. And less than 100 megahertz guard band is going to create design perspective very different from the normal one. It has to have very accurate LNBCs with sharp cutoff filters. So otherwise, we have to put kind of additional filters, and then disturbs the entire ecosystem, because it has to create intercircular, then some harmonic, and then weight, etc. will this destabilize the receiving system, due to wind and other disturbances. So those things are being addressed, but it is huge task, and C-band phenomena is quite disturbing. And apart from that, when we put this additional filters, they put the insertion last, and then our link budget is disturbed. Whatever signal we require to get better decoding, that we have to increase. For that, we have to increase the antenna size. So entire receiving system has to be changed. That has a huge task and the cost. We are trying to address it, but it's still to be done. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm remembering when I think it was in Brazil when there was the World Cup and it was interrupted because of interference, and there was almost riots on the street. And I can only imagine what would happen if Indian TV is interfered with or disrupted. There would be riots like nobody could imagine. Okay, let's, if I can come back to Mahesh.
I can supplement one point as well, because TRI has recently given some recommendation, and there it has recommended that the INT service provider has to use better mask for out-of-band emission, so that they don't interfere with the broadcasting network.
Good advice indeed. Okay, I wanted to move to the method of charging for satellite spectrum. Right now, that's a percentage of the revenues that the operator earns. Mahesh, I wanted to get your views. Do you believe that this is the optimum way of charging for spectrum? What can India learn from global best practices in this field?
I think my own view is more in the context of the Indian mobile spectrum, as in terrestrial mobile spectrum. And I do believe that the revenue sharing regime actually that we follow in India has actually been counterproductive. And in fact, it is, we know instances where operators forwent their own revenues to gain market share, which in turn, of course, affected the government share of their revenue, because the government gets a share of revenue. My point is that I do not believe that revenue sharing itself is a very smart thing to do. I think what we do need is the input of very, very competent and accountable regulators in all this. And in fact, if there is another aspect of the bill which is very worrying, is that in a situation which is fast evolving, both at the technology and the economy and the business end, we are going to actually reduce the role of the TRAI. That is one key message from the draft bill, which I think is not being discussed sufficiently, and I think it is very worrying. So I would, instead of prescribing whether revenue sharing is or is not a good way, or what the alternative fixed rate, or for that matter free access is, I would not venture to do that. But what I do think is that these things do require accountable regulators who have an interest in the growth of sectors, who have an interest in ensuring fair and effective competition. If those kinds of, and an interest in removing any kind or compensating for any kind of market failure. So as long as we deal with that, I think we would arrive at some sensible, economically sensible approaches to pricing of spectrum.
Thank you. Tony?
Thank you. As I am responsible for market access for one of the satellite operators, still, and I'm responsible for the European market access, but I have also overview across the globe. My experience with the charging for spectrum, at least in the European environment, it's very simple. The majority of the European countries do not charge for spectrum, or if they charge something, it's a very minimal amount of sum, like 500 euros or 1,000 euros, the maximum. because spectrum is not seen to be a revenue-generating, let's say, aspect for them. What instead happens is that it's not so much a satellite operator where they make the money, or at least recover. It's a cost recovery amount of money that they need to ask for is to the service provider, because the important thing is that the satellite operator is providing capacity, it's providing a coverage, but the actual user of the spectrum is your service provider, and the service provider actually makes the revenues locally. And so what happens in Europe is that they are required to register or notify the administration that they are a service provider in that country, and that goes all across the European Union and across all the countries. And the amount of charge for that service provision or that notification is based on a very small percentage of their revenue in that country. So let's say 0.5 to about 1.5% of their revenues. So actually the satellite operators which provide the infrastructure, which they already have to pay, they have to get finance for, and they have to sort of make it available, then the service provider, which could be the satellite operator in some cases, but on other cases, they're not. They are only a capacity provider. It's a local, instead a local entity is the one actually being using that spectrum, because they import the equipment, they install the equipment, maintain it, and they provide the service provision to the end user, which could be the public or could be a company, basically. So the model in Europe is very simple. The spectrum is not being charged for, except maybe for one country, which is still based, actually the spectrum charging model is wrong, because they, instead of apportioning the cost to the different operators, they actually charge each individual operator the same price. And that actually is wrong, because again, it's all about cost to themselves. In the rest of the world, it's very similar to what's happened in Europe. It's the service provider who's charged for spectrum. But often, look at it from this way. If you charge for spectrum, who's going to pay for it? The end customer. So if I'm trying to build a system which provides low cost and giving you also to each individual country, the issue of barrier to entry again, as I mentioned earlier, if I'm providing an infrastructure free of charge, I'm paying for it through financing. I'm trying to now recover that finance through selling my capacity. Don't charge for spectrum. Charge the local service providers providing the services to the end user, because they are the ones who are making the money, not the satellite operator. Otherwise, if I'm charged, I have to ask the service provider locally to pay for it. So it's going to increase the pricing of access to telecommunications, access to communication and connectivity. So that there has to be a balance, and I think the regulators, as I was once myself, we have to have a balance. In the UK, again, we go through a network license, not a spectrum license. A network license is only £600, because it's a cost recovery fee. That's it.
Let me bring in Laura on this point for a second.
Thank you, Aarti. Very briefly, spectrum charge based on a percentage of revenue is not a common practice internationally. Normally, it's the license that is required in some countries to provide service to the end user, so that in some occasions can be charged as a percentage of revenue. However, it can work as it works in India when it comes to local providers. However, and this is along the lines of what Tony has mentioned, when international service providers or foreign satellite operators are getting involved, for instance, with the deployment of a gateway, then this method of charging spectrum as a percentage of revenue can lead to significant complications, because an international service provider or a foreign satellite operator usually does not declare revenue in a specific country. So overall, other methods such as a fixed fee or a fee that is proportional to the spectrum that is being used within the reason are better way to charge for the spectrum.
Thank you. Bharat, I would like to bring you back in. We heard Mahesh talk about the potential reduced role of TRI. Now, when we look at what has been happening, first of all, taking satellite C-band, giving it to IMT, now considering Ka band and so on, these are capacity bands. They are not coverage bands. That tells me very clearly that the priority is not on expanding connectivity to areas which does not have it. It's just about giving more spectrum to mobile operators for higher capacity services in areas where it is already being stretched. What's your view?
So, Aarti, I will still, go by what I said earlier. I'll just bring in, I'll just quote a very ambitious project of the government of India, which is a BharatNet project, right? We already saw the BharatNet 1, the BharatNet 2, and now we are in the process of coming out with the BharatNet 3 project, which is essentially going to connect, the unconnected villages, the announcement for which was even made by the Prime Minister of India from the ramparts of Red Fort. So the government's intent, right, is very clear. It wants to go and give connectivity to the areas which are not served or which are underserved. Even you look at the telecom bill, the draft telecom bill, if I can just quote, it talks about, it has done away with something called as the USOF, but instead it is talking about the Telecom Development Fund, right? The Telecom Development Fund, again, it focuses around providing connectivity to the unconnected, and here there is an important, a rider which has been placed, and which is is that it is going to provide connectivity to the unconnected even in the urban areas. So there are urban pockets where you do not have the connectivity. So this TDF fund, which is there, part of the telecom bill, is going to focus in providing connectivity to those areas also. So the intent of the government is very clear, and that is Antyodaya. I mean, for providing connectivity to the last man standing, to the remotest place. I mean, that is very clear. But yes, coming back to your point, the millimetric wave that bands, or the 26 gigahertz band that we have, just saw the auction part of it. Yes, they are high capacity bands, but then the focus of those bands, or the focus of the primary objective of those bands, are providing connectivity for the captive private wireless networks, for the enterprise networks, for the industrial automation, right? So that is the area where the government is making, is giving a due diligence, it is giving a thought to that. And we did speak about the 27.5 to 28.5 during the break, the mixed usage part of it, and how it is going to be a little difficult for the IMT and the satellite communication both to survive. Needless to say, I also wish to put one, point here is related to the 5925 to the 6425 megahertz band, which is again very important, especially once we want to have a very wide proliferation of the broadband connectivity within the country, with the Wi-Fi 6E, which gives similar, features like a 5G in an outdoor environment. What 5G gives, a Wi-Fi 6E would provide you the same connectivity, the same features in an indoor, environment. But then it has a conflict with the satellite, because that is a downlink for the C-band. And therefore, there is a need for having a couple of studies for, coexistence studies can be one of the ways, coming out with very stringent standards, protocols, and what Mr. Rajeev said is a very sharp cutoff bandpass filters. I mean, those things are there. FCC certainly has looked into it. It has come out with those standards and things of this nature. But yes, I would still say that although high capacity, but still the intent is to serve the underserved, and to provide a new impetus to the industry 4.0, which India needs a lot at this moment.
Okay, I want to take a slightly different train of thought now. India has always been very good at keeping up and even surpassing. When I keep coming back to the mobile operators, because I find it astounding what they have achieved here. The fact that you can have Netflix and other streaming options included in your mobile subscription. We in Europe can only dream of that kind of thing. That doesn't exist, right? So at the same time, you have this dichotomy. You have India leading the way on what can be achieved with mobile connectivity. You still have India with a massive digital divide. But now in the West, 5G, it's kind of going a little bit out of fashion, despite the fact that, as Tony said, you've got like only 5% of any population which has it. But now we're starting to talk about 6G, and GSOA has just issued a paper on satellite and their role in 6G. And the reason being that the mobile vendors, so GSA and its members, have started saying that now is the time to start thinking about spectrum for 6G, because it takes time to find it, to refarm it, etc., etc. Now, given how good India is at moving forward, thinking ahead, and pushing the boundaries on what can be achieved, is this going to be the next excuse for mobile operators to secure more satellite spectrum? And if so, where is that heading? Who wants to start with comments on that?
The first question is, what is 6G? What is 5G? It's not the same thing that we already have, but named differently, just because you have a new technology or new modulation scheme or whatsoever. It's still IoT or some kind of connectivity still in place. The issue is always about this. The end user will have this. They don't care if it's 5G or 6G or 4G at the end of the day. Now, the question is why you need to have more spectrum when there is still spectrum which is unused by the IMT. I call IMT anything which could be any Gs, basically. It's IMT, International Mobile Telecommunication, the way the ITUs defined it, basically. So, more spectrum. And then the other question, why is satellite harmonized spectrum globally always attacked? And I use the word attacked because that's the way we perceive it. Because the minute that and is it the mobile operators or is it the manufacturers that are actually attacking the spectrum, basically? The question is, again, why is it always targeted, the satellite spectrum? And why do I say that? Because which spectrum? This doesn't work in Ka band or QMV band. It doesn't have the antenna or the power. You need basically a battery as big as a stable to operate in QMV band or Ka band. So don't tell me you need more spectrum in the satellite bands, the broadband satellite bands that our constellations are working on today. You need spectrum around 1 gigahertz, maybe below 1 gigahertz. Maybe you need to refarm your TV digital spectrum. And there is actually allocations at around 400, 600 megahertz, basically, for IMT. So why are in those bands being used by 5G and 6G? Because in fact, if it's mostly IoT devices, they work extremely well, those frequencies. So again, the question is, who's driving for this demand, and where is the demand for that? We think there is a demand in 10 years' time, okay? But it's in 10 years' time. Okay, you want to be assured to have the spectrum. You have the spectrum. There is spectrum at 400, 500, 600, 800 megahertz, 900 megahertz. Let's use that. Let's refarm that. Again, in the satellite community or satellite technology, we don't call it refarming. What we do is we reuse the same spectrum and be compatible with the previous generation. That's what you need to do. Use the same 2G spectrum for 3G as long as they're both compatible to each other. That's the solution, I think.
We only have a couple of minutes left, so let me get comments from our other panelists. So
Aarti, just one point on the lighter side. All the even Gs have succeeded and all the odd Gs have failed. So if we look at that, obviously we know the inevitable. So let's start working towards 6G then.
we should actually have, we're in India, we should have some kind of an astrological analysis done on this and see what it comes out with. Laura, what are your thoughts on the whole 6G and 6G spectrum story?
Well, the answer to your question is probably yes. It will be used as an excuse. However, now it really comes down to, to the satellite industry to make the point, to be alerted, and also to, it comes down to regulators to be aware of these. And it is at the end of the day the responsibility of regulators to create an environment that allows for an optimal synergy between satellite and terrestrial services, because again, especially when we go towards high frequencies, as you mentioned, they're not for coverage. That's against the law of physics. So in order to ensure that mobile services are provided to populations in more remote areas, difficult to reach, for instance, a global synergy is represented by satellites being used for backhauling, while the terrestrial operators can provide the access for the last mile.
Thank you. Just a quick answer from you, Rajeev, please.
I want to just say that 5G, 6G, it is better GSOA. GSOA means there is a program, GSOA छत पर है. So I remember that the content what we provide through our network, this may be 5G or 6G or satellite broadcasting or any other thing. So the content is more important. What Mr. Tony, I think he said, that it has to be not technology driven, but the consumer driven. What consumer wants, that we should be able to provide. The last mile connectivity, the last mile connectivity, that is important. Thank you.
Thank you. Mahesh ji, your comments on this?
I can add more either in terms of content or humor, so I'll stop. I'm fine, thank you.
Right. So we're almost at the end. Well, we are at the end, but I want to ask each of the panelists for one line. If there was one recommendation that you could give on driving forward this telecom bill to the government, what would your one-line recommendation be, your top priority? Mahesh ji?
I would say recognize that this particular industry has worked brilliantly, the private sector has done brilliantly in this industry the world over. Recognize in the bill the need to remove any kinds of barriers either to investment or to technologies or to business models. Make sure that we put up with that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Rajeev, please, your one-line recommendation to the government. Mahesh ji, if you could give the mic.
I really thank for the policymaker to give due importance to the national requirements. And in my opinion, that includes public service broadcasting, what Doordarshan and AIR provide.
Thank you. Bharat ji?
I would just say concentrate on the user, that is most important, the industry for the ease of doing business. And lastly, the nation. I mean, how the entire act puts India in the topmost position, and how India becomes a global, champion for the telecom. The bill should be enabling all these factors.
Thank you. Tony? One line, Tony.
Yes, I take a lot of lines. And well, look, if Europe has done it for 20 years to liberalize telecommunications and spectrum use and licensing, market access, and remember there's now 27, there used to be 28 countries, 27 countries to deal with, and each one individually has a different language and a different culture. They have done it. I'm sure you can do it. So I just give you my best wishes to have your regulations improving, to think about the end user especially. Who are you serving? The end user being the farmers or the passengers on the boats or on an airplane. They're the ones who are actually getting the benefits out of this. So you want to increase your economy, you want to have growth, liberalize your telecoms. And technical solutions will take care of security and safety. They're there, they exist today.
Thanks. Laura?
Thank you. I would just say keep just the interests of the end user in mind, also in terms of choice and synergy of available technology.
Brilliant. And I will add my 2 cents to this as well. My recommendation would be do not try to put India on the map with 5G or 6G. India is already on the map. Put it on the development map by showing that you can actually connect your rural citizens and a mass of the Indian population, and satellite is the way to do that. So on that note, would you please join me in thanking our panelists for what I think was an extremely interesting discussion. Thank you very much.